He was a decorated sheriff, a pillar of law and order in his small Texas town. A man who had dedicated his life to justice, to protecting the innocent, and upholding the very laws that held society together. She was his beautiful, devoted wife, a woman of elegance and mystery, who seemed to appear in his life at just the right moment. Their love story was one of fate, passion, and second chances. To the outside world, they were the perfect couple. But behind closed doors, one devastating secret lurked beneath the surface. A secret so dark, so horrifying, that when it finally came to light, it turned their perfect marriage into a blood-soaked nightmare. What happens when the person you love most is hiding a past so monstrous it defies belief? How far would you go to silence the truth? And when the dust settles, who is the real victim, the deceived or the deceiver? Before we dive into this chilling case, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Inspector Stan for more terrifying tales of love, deception, and murder. Jen Robbins was a man defined by his strong moral code, a pillar of justice in the small town of Cedar Hollow, Texas. At 42, he had earned a reputation as a dedicated sheriff, respected by his peers and admired by the community. His ambition was clear, he dreamed of becoming a Texas Ranger, and every decision he made was guided by that vision. Jen had suffered immense pain in his personal life, having lost his first wife, Margaret, to a prolonged illness. After her death, he threw himself into his work, never imagining that he would find love again. That is, until he met Sable Montclair. At 36, Sable was a striking woman, intelligent, poised, and full of mystery. Her charm was magnetic, and Jen found himself captivated by her from the moment they met. They crossed paths at a church fundraiser 6 months prior, an event Jen had attended more out of duty than devotion. The gathering was filled with familiar faces. Town elders, community leaders, and the same families he had known for years. But among them was someone new. Sable's beauty and intelligence stood out in the crowd. She was striking, her deep brown skin glowing under the soft lights of the church hall, her high cheekbones giving her an almost regal quality. And then there were her eyes, sharp, observant, revealing just enough emotion to keep him guessing. Jen felt a sudden pull, a magnetic force he couldn't explain. She wasn't just another woman in a crowd, she stood apart, captivating everyone with an energy that was impossible to ignore. When she caught his gaze, she didn't shy away. Instead, she smiled, a knowing smile that seemed to carry a secret just for him. Her eyes held secrets, and Jen found himself wanting to uncover them. She introduced herself with that same smooth confidence. "Sheriff Robbins," she said, her voice warm, rich, and self-assured. "I've heard a lot about you." There was no hint of fear in her tone, no apprehension of his badge or his position. In fact, there was something about her demeanor that made Jen feel almost disarmed. She wasn't intimidated by him, and in that moment, he found himself intrigued. Her story was compelling, the kind of story that made her seem too perfect, too easy to believe. She told him she had recently moved from Louisiana, looking for peace and a fresh start after years of working as a nurse in the chaos of the city. It was the perfect story, believable, compelling, and, most importantly, difficult to verify. It didn't take long for Jen to find himself captivated, buying into her story. She was everything he hadn't realized he'd been looking for, intelligent, confident, and mysterious. Jen had always prided himself on being able to read people, but Sable. She was an enigma. And for once, he didn't mind being left guessing. Within weeks of meeting her, he was smitten. Sable was unlike any woman Jen had ever known. She was fiercely independent, confident, and possessed a quiet strength that intrigued him. In her, he saw the perfect partner, a woman who could stand beside him as he pursued his dreams. Jen was convinced that Sable was everything he needed, smart, supportive, and beautiful. She seemed to understand his life's purpose, and their connection felt like something out of a fairy tale. Their whirlwind romance took off rapidly. Within months, Jen was planning a grand wedding, one that was to be the talk of the town. It seemed that everything was falling into place, the perfect career, the perfect wife, and the perfect future. Sable quickly became a fixture in Jen's life, and the community was eager to embrace her. They saw her as the poised, supportive wife who stood beside her husband, the lawman. The couple was admired by all, their union hailed as a testament to love and second chances. Jen, ever the proud sheriff, was seen as a man who had found happiness after his tragic loss. Sable, meanwhile, appeared to fit seamlessly into the role of the loving, gracious wife. To the outside world, they were the perfect couple, an embodiment of strength, love, and new beginnings. The love they shared seemed almost too perfect, their relationship untouched by anything that might mar it. But Jen, despite the adoration surrounding their union, couldn't help but feel a gnawing sense of unease. His heart told him that Sable was everything he had ever wanted, but something deep inside him whispered that there was more to her than met the eye. Still, he dismissed these doubts, convincing himself that they were simply the fears of a man who had loved and lost before. As the months went by, Jen continued to immerse himself in his career, with Sable by his side every step of the way. Together, they seemed unstoppable. Their relationship, at least on the surface, was flawless. The community saw their love story as proof that second chances existed, that happiness could be found even after pain. But Jen's doubts remained, buried beneath the surface, overshadowed by his growing feelings for Sable. Little did he know, his world was about to be shattered in ways he never could have imagined. 3 weeks into their marriage, Jen Robbins was working late at the station, sifting through files with the patience of a man who had done this job for decades. It was supposed to be a routine night, processing minor arrests, reviewing reports, making sure the town remained quiet under his watch. One of the night's arrests was a vagrant caught trespassing on private property. He was just another drifter, someone who would likely be gone by morning. But protocol required a background check, and as Jen navigated through the state's old criminal records, his eyes landed on a grainy, black-and-white mugshot buried deep within the system. The face staring back at him sent a chill through his spine. It was her. Sable Montclair was not Sable Montclair. Her real name was Ivora Greer. And she was a monster. The screen before him illuminated the truth, each line of text more horrifying than the last. Ivora Greer, better known as the Nightshade Widow, was a convicted serial killer responsible for some of the most gruesome murders in Southern history. She had seduced, married, and murdered at least 6 wealthy men across Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas, each victim meeting a nightmarish end. Her crimes were the kind that lived in whispered folklore: poisoning, mutilation, dismemberment. The most disturbing detail? She had been known to keep her victims' severed fingers as trophies. 8 years ago, she had been sentenced to life without parole. The court had deemed her irredeemable, a predator without remorse. But during a riot at the Louisiana penitentiary where she was held, a fire broke out, consuming a large portion of the facility. In the chaos, Ivora vanished, presumed dead, until now. Jen's blood turned to ice. He had married a ghost. A ghost with blood on her hands. In the weeks leading up to this moment, the signs had been there, small but unsettling. Sable had always been careful, but there were cracks in her mask. Late-night phone calls she quickly ended when he walked into the room. Evasive answers when he asked about her past. A certain stillness in her eyes, an unnatural calmness that sometimes unsettled him. He had brushed off the unease, convinced himself that love meant trust, that some mysteries were better left unsolved. But there was no denying this. The woman sleeping in his bed, the woman he had sworn to protect, the woman he had dreamed of building a future with, she was a predator. A murderer. And if she had killed before, she would kill again. The question was no longer who she was. The question was, what would he do about it? Jen's hands trembled on the steering wheel, his mind racing. His wife, was a serial killer. Not just any killer, but Ivora Greer, the Nightshade widow, a woman whose crimes had haunted the South for years. His stomach churned as he imagined her past victims, men who had trusted and loved her, only to be tortured and butchered. The thought of her lying beside him at night, touching his skin with the same hands that had dismembered bodies, made his blood run cold. By the time he pulled into the driveway, his heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. The house was dark except for the faint glow of the living room lamp. He stepped inside cautiously, fingers brushing the gun at his hip. Sable was waiting. She sat in the dimly lit room, a glass of red wine in hand, legs crossed as if she had been expecting him. Her expression was unreadable, but something in her eyes made his skin crawl. Slowly, she took a sip, then set the glass down. "You found out, didn't you?" Her voice was eerily calm. Jen's throat tightened. "Who are you?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Sable smiled, tilting her head slightly. "You already know." Anger surged through him. "I want to hear you say it." She let out a quiet chuckle, shaking her head. "Oh, Jen," she sighed, "you should have left it alone." His home, his sanctuary, now felt like a crime scene waiting to happen. The woman he had loved and trusted was nothing more than a master manipulator wearing a mask. "You murdered them," he said, voice shaking. "All of them. You planned it, married them, and you." Sable cut him off with a laugh, standing up slowly. "They were weak, Jen," she said, voice dripping with amusement. "Fools who thought love made them invincible. But love is just another weakness." She took a step closer. "And you were supposed to be the strongest of them all." Jen reached for his gun, but Sable was faster. From the folds of her silk robe, she pulled a knife and slashed at him, the blade slicing deep into his arm. He grunted in pain, stumbling as blood seeped through his shirt. Sable's eyes gleamed. "I really did love you," she whispered. "But you should have never found out." Fueled by pain, rage, and pure survival instinct, Jen lunged at her, grabbing her wrist before she could strike again. They struggled, crashing into furniture, knocking over the wine glass, red liquid spilling across the floor like blood. Sable clawed at his face, her nails raking his skin, but Jen was stronger. With a burst of strength, he slammed her head against the marble countertop. She let out a sharp cry, her body momentarily limp. But even as blood trickled from her temple, she smiled. That was the final straw. With his wounded arm throbbing, his vision swimming from exhaustion and fury, Jen wrapped his hands around her throat. Her nails dug into his skin, her body twisting beneath him, but he didn't let go. He couldn't. She had fooled him. Manipulated him. Slept beside him, knowing she was a monster. With every ounce of strength left in him, he squeezed until the life drained from her eyes. Until the Nightshade widow was no more. Jen stood over Sable's lifeless body, his breath ragged, his hands still wrapped around her throat. His mind screamed at him to move, but he was frozen, staring at what he had done. The woman he had once adored, the woman he had planned a future with, was nothing more than a lifeless husk on the cold kitchen floor. Panic set in. His entire career, his reputation, his life, all of it would be destroyed if anyone found out. He was the sheriff, a man sworn to uphold the law, and now he was a murderer. There was no coming back from this. Unless, he erased her. With trembling hands, he retrieved a hunting knife from the garage, the same one he had used to dress deer. The irony wasn't lost on him. The first cut was the hardest, his stomach churning as he forced the blade through flesh and bone. But once he started, something inside him numbed. Methodically, he dismembered Sable's body, stuffing each piece into garbage bags. Blood coated his hands, his clothes, the floor. The smell of iron and death filled the room, but he kept going, driven by raw survival instinct. By the time the sun began to rise, the deed was done. He loaded the bags into his truck and drove deep into the pine woods behind their home, an area he knew like the back of his hand. With a shovel and sheer desperation, he dug a shallow grave beneath a thicket of brush, tossing in the bags and covering them with dirt and fallen leaves. When it was over, he stood there, staring at the disturbed ground, convincing himself she was gone for good. For the next week, Jen played his role perfectly. He went to work, attended church, smiled at neighbors. If anyone noticed he was quieter than usual, they chalked it up to exhaustion from his job. He was safe. He had buried the past. Until the past clawed its way back. 7 days after Sable's death, a fisherman at a nearby dock made a grisly discovery: a severed hand, bloated and pale, washed ashore with the current. And wrapped around one delicate, lifeless finger was a wedding ring. Sable's wedding ring. Within hours, the remains were identified, and the case of the Nightshade widow's gruesome murder became a statewide sensation. The media swarmed Cedar Hollow, speculating about her past, about who could have killed her. Law enforcement launched a high-profile investigation. Jen watched the news, his stomach twisting into knots. He had buried her. He had erased her. Or so he thought. As the days passed, the walls closed in on Jen. What had seemed like the perfect cover-up began to unravel with alarming speed. Investigators, determined to solve the mystery of Sable's disappearance, discovered blood traces in Jen's truck. Security footage from a nearby store showed him purchasing trash bags the same night Sable went missing. His alibi, once airtight, now had gaping holes. The small town that had once admired him as their pillar of justice now saw him through a new, damning lens. Jen's reputation as a lawman crumbled. He was no longer the sheriff, they had a murderer in their midst. The media exploded with the news, the story of a respected officer turning violent, dominating the national headlines. Was Jen a hero who had stopped a deadly woman on the run? Or was he just another man driven by rage, taking matters into his own hands? The debate swirled endlessly, but one thing was certain: Jen was at the center of it all. Jen could only watch as his world shattered. It wasn't long before the investigators had him cornered. The mounting evidence was overwhelming. With no way out, he was left with only one option: to confess. He stood before the detectives, his face drawn and weary, and admitted to killing Sable, but claimed it was in self-defense. He said she had attacked him with a knife, forcing him to act in a moment of fear and rage. He tried to justify the disposal of her body, but the details were too disturbing, even for him. The investigators saw through his words. His defense didn't explain the brutality of his actions. The murder had been cold, calculated, and the disposal of the body was just as calculated. Jen was arrested, his handcuffed wrists a stark contrast to the man who once carried a badge with pride. He was charged with second-degree murder and abuse of a corpse. The community was left to pick up the pieces, unsure of who to believe. The man they had trusted to uphold the law had now become a symbol of broken justice. The trial was nothing short of a media spectacle, a battle that drew in the attention of the nation. Jen sat quietly in the defendant's chair, his face gaunt, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his actions. The prosecution painted him as a man who, despite his position as sheriff, had allowed personal rage and fear to override his sense of duty. They argued that Jen, faced with the truth of his wife's monstrous past, had taken the law into his own hands in the most savage way possible. He didn't just kill Sable, he murdered her with a level of cruelty that no one could justify. The grisly dismemberment of her body, the calculated steps he took to cover up the crime, painted a picture of a man who had crossed a line far beyond self-defense. For them, it wasn't about the fear of being betrayed, it was about his inability to control his emotions, letting anger guide his actions rather than reason. The defense, however, painted a different picture. They argued that Jen had acted out of self-defense and sheer desperation. They reminded the court of the horrifying truth Jen had uncovered, that Sable was a cold-blooded killer, responsible for the deaths of multiple men, a woman who had spent years hiding her true identity. They claimed that Jen had no idea the woman he married was a serial killer, that he had been deceived into believing he was with someone capable of love, only to find out she was a monster who had destroyed other lives. Was it so unreasonable, they asked, for a man to react violently when his entire world was turned upside down by such a revelation? In the end, the jury deliberated for only a few hours. The evidence, while damning, had one major flaw: Jen had confessed to the crime, claiming it was in the heat of the moment. But the brutality of his actions couldn't be ignored, and the jury quickly came to a decision. Jen was found guilty of second-degree murder. The court was silent as the verdict was read aloud, a collective breath held by all who had watched this tragedy unfold. Jen's face remained expressionless, but his eyes betrayed a deep sorrow, a realization that his life, as he knew it, was over. The judge, after a brief statement, sentenced Jen to 45 years in prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no second chances for him, no redemption. His life was now a cautionary tale. As Jen was led away in handcuffs, the public reaction was mixed. Some saw him as a tragic figure, a man who had been duped into marrying a monster, a man who had been forced to act in the only way he knew how. They believed that he deserved sympathy for being the victim of such a horrifying betrayal. Others, however, saw a killer, one who allowed his rage to consume him, who had murdered his wife in cold blood, no matter what her past might have been. They argued that no matter the circumstances, his actions had been too extreme, too violent. Jen's fate was sealed. To some, he was a broken man who had fallen victim to a twisted love story. To others, he was a killer who let his emotions take control, leaving destruction in his wake. In the end, there would be no clear answer. Just the bitter reality of a sheriff, a man sworn to uphold justice, who had become an example of how easily justice could slip through the cracks. This case stands as a chilling reminder of how deception, secrets, and the weight of past sins can unravel everything: relationships, lives, and even a man's identity. Jen Robbins, a respected sheriff who once upheld the law, now finds himself behind bars, forever haunted by the woman he loved and the dark truth he uncovered too late. His story is one of betrayal, where love blinded him to the woman he married, until the horrors of her past came crashing down on him. By the time he realized the full extent of her lies, it was already too late. In his mind, there was no other choice but to act. But in the end, his actions didn't protect him from the consequences of his violence, they only sealed his fate. Was Jen a victim of betrayal, or did he allow his anger and fear to consume him, making him no better than the killer he had sworn to bring to justice? Could this have ended differently if he had made different choices, or was he doomed from the start, caught in a web of deception that ultimately cost him everything? The question remains unanswered. If this case shook you, like and subscribe to Inspector Stan for more chilling tales of love, lies, and betrayal.